I want to start by looking back to a historical period that I think many of us have great nostalgia for. The decades immediately after World War II. Most of us have an emotional connection to that time. Either our parents grew up then, or we grew up then, or our grandparents grew up then. It reminds us of a time when the United States seemed to be not only on top of the world, but still rising. Here in Los Angeles, the city was coming out of the war and enjoying the beginning of a great long boom, not only becoming the movie studio to the world, but making furniture and making cars and making planes and making clothes. And there really was a lot that was good about that time. Living standards were rising rapidly, and they were rising for great numbers of people. And I understand why we have nostalgia too that goes beyond any economic statistics. Just think of the popular culture. In New York, we had the great era of baseball with 3 teams. Here in California, you took 2 of our teams and you had the beginning of professional baseball. In movies and music, there was Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and James Dean and the Beatles and the people who still continue to cast a shadow over today. My family and I ate last night at a wonderful Thai restaurant that I'm guessing many of the locals are familiar with, Jitlada. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Absolutely one of the best Thai meals I've ever had. And the walls are filled with not only photos of popular culture stars from today, but popular culture stars from the 50s and 60s before many of the people who were eating in the restaurant that night were born. And yet, for all this nostalgia, I want to urge you today to think back empirically, as the Schaeffer Center tries to do. Think back empirically to that time and ask yourselves, how good was it really? How does it compare to today, really? And when you do that, when you review the evidence, I think you'll emerge thinking the same thing that I've emerged thinking. It was not a golden age of American life. The golden age of American life is now. We are living it. Yes, we have problems. We have big problems, and I'll get to them today. But it is a mistake to lose sight of how much has gone well in recent decades in this society. In fact, losing sight of how much has gone well makes it harder to solve the big problems that we have. It confuses us about what our problems are and where we've made progress and what we might do to solve the problems that we continue to have. I recognize that there's something a little bit hard to accept about the idea that the golden age is now. I recognize that it is at odds with public opinion. You look at surveys, about 30% of Americans think the country is headed in the right direction. That's not that big a number. It's much smaller than has been the case in many other times. How free are we? How many people around the world, not just this country, live in democracies? How many people in this country suffer stifling discrimination on a daily basis? When you look at the basic answer to every one of these questions, I don't see any conclusion but that the world is a much better place than it used to be. And that isn't always the case. It's not always the case that life gets better. For most of human history, it didn't. For most of human history, the human lifespan did not increase at all. Economies grew virtually nil. Since 1900, on the other hand, which is a blink of an eye historically, lifespans have risen 50%. After centuries of barely rising at all, we have had, at the end of the great boom of living standards of the last 400 or 500 years, an additional 50% increase in lifespans. Yes, longevity gains are now slowing, but that's partly a good news story. It's hard to make big gains on longevity when infant mortality is as low as it is today in much of the world. And it's not just relative either. The last couple of decades have actually brought major health advances in their own right. We've made major gains in treating heart disease. We've made some of the first gains in treating cancer. The war on cancer seemed just to be failing for a long time. It still hasn't succeeded, but it's made real progress. Try visiting a hospital department where they treat childhood leukemia and think about whether life is better now than it used to be. The kids you will meet there, many of them would not have lived to see their 18th birthday several decades ago. Many of them will now live full lives. In the starkest terms, I would guess that most people sitting here today have a family member or a friend who would not be alive today if medical progress was even 50 years less advanced than it is. To get personal for a minute, my own grandfather, Rene, died as a relatively young man in 1950, of all years. given the nostalgia for the 1950s and 60s. Needless to say, I hope I did not meet him. My father was 6 years old at the time. It's impossible to know exactly what would have been the case. We believe my grandfather died of cancer. But there is a very good chance that he would have lived decades longer, that my father would have grown up with a father, that I might have met my grandfather, if medical progress had advanced even a few decades more rapidly than it actually did, if we had the medicine of today rather than the medicine of 1950. The great longevity boom that has come with this medical progress has, not surprisingly, caused a population boom, right? When people aren't dying, they're living. They're around the world. I'm guessing some people here have some memories of the overpopulation scares of the 1970s. Maybe others of you have read about it. There's a fabulous book called The Bet that is recently out that covers some of these topics. Johnny Carson used to invite a biologist named Paul Ehrlich onto The Tonight Show, and Paul Ehrlich would issue warnings of mass starvation thanks to overpopulation. The world would be overrun with billions of people, and there wouldn't be enough food, and lots of people would die. The overpopulation doomsayers were right about one thing. The world's population exploded. We have 7 billion people. But instead of that bringing calamity, life for the average person on the planet is longer than it was when we had only a few billion people, which is remarkable. In 1980, 42% of the world had to find a way to live on the equivalent of $1 a day. 42% of the world. Today, after doing the inflation adjustments that you should do, 14% of the world has to find a way to live on $1 a day. That is far too many people who have to find a way to live on $1 a day. But 14% is also a lot better than 42%. It's true that in many countries, including our own, society has become economically more unequal over this time. I'm guessing that's not news to all of you. You read stories in papers like mine written by people like me about the rise of economic inequality, and it's true. But the world is actually less unequal than it was a generation ago, thanks to the rise of India and China. And even in the Western world, there are ways as economic inequality has boomed that we are more equal than we used to be. Was life more equal in the 1950s and 60s? Sure, if you look at something called the Gini coefficient and do some economic calculations. Was it more equal for women than it is today? I think that's a pretty hard argument to make, given the terrible sexism of the 1950s and 60s. Was it more equal for Catholics, for Mormons, for Jews? I think that's also a pretty hard argument to make. I mentioned my grandfather, René, already. He fled the Nazis in Germany. He came here. My father grew up not having to flee the Nazis, but had to deal with a fair amount of pretty nasty anti-Semitism. I've had to deal with essentially none. Is life less equal today for African Americans, for Latinos, for Asian Americans? Is it less equal today for gays and lesbians? I don't see any argument that it is. Now, even for the people who don't fit into any of these categories, which by my math are Protestant, white, straight men, and I have nothing against them. I'm related to many Protestant, white, straight men. But they are a small minority of the country. And even for them, I would argue that life is better in many ways than it used to be. They too benefit from the gains in childhood leukemia care. They too benefit from the gains in heart and cancer care. And I've emphasized health, not just because I'm here visiting the Schaeffer Center, and not just because of how much news it's taken up, but because health is the most important. It's not the only thing, though. Think about other ways that life has improved. Think about how much easier it is to stay in touch with your friends and your relatives than it used to be. When immigrants moved here decades ago, they said goodbye to home. They could not afford to go home, and they could not afford to talk to people at home. That is no longer the case. Think about how much easier it is to talk to people day to day. Think about how much easier it is to see them thanks to the democratization of air travel. Or not just to see family and friends, but decide you want to go see someplace new, and you go and you do it because it costs only $150. And I realized I just praised the airline industry, which no doubt I will regret in about 48 hours when I'm sitting in one of their seats. But the fact is, the reason flying the airlines feels like a bus today is because in class terms, it is a bus today. It is a mass form of travel. The people who talk about the golden age of air travel were relatively small number of people who could actually afford air travel back in the golden age of air travel. It seems particularly appropriate to mention here in Los Angeles that it's also the case that people can now enjoy home movies, what once used to be a great luxury. They can listen, even if they're in the middle of a relatively rural place without a great library, they can listen to some of the greatest music ever written and recorded and read some of the greatest books ever written. I know some people dismiss technology as luxuries that don't matter that much. Most of the people who do already enjoy those luxuries. There is a reason why people, when they have the chance to enjoy them, they do. And they do improve people's lives. And they are part of the improvement in living standards that we've seen. If you'll pardon just a minute of parochialism, my own industry and my own newspaper is a good example of what I'm talking about. It would be very easy to wring my hands about the state of journalism today. I wish we enjoyed the profits that journalism did 30 or 40 years ago. I wish we had the semi-monopolies that the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other newspapers used to have. It was great where basically a newspaper was a license to print money because it was a license to print ads and the only way that people could get it. Yes, it would be nice to recover that. On the other hand, journalism is vastly better today than it ever was. We have many more people reading the New York Times than ever read it before in the so-called golden age. We also are better at what we do. We don't simply write 1,100-word stories and put little charts in the newspaper. We can do all these fabulous multimedia interactive things. The most visited page in the history of the New York Times is the Dialect quiz that came out in December. If you haven't taken it, it takes about 60 seconds and it's an enormous amount of fun. Google NYT Dialect quiz. It is the most visited page in the history of the New York Times. It was created by an intern by the name of Josh Katz, who now works for our new project called the Upshot. It would have been impossible a decade ago. We could have put a map in the newspaper with some neat shadings and told you how people in different parts of the country talk. We couldn't have had you take a 25-question quiz based on hundreds of thousands of surveys that people have filled out online and immediately give you insight into your own speech patterns. I've run through this whole litany of good news not as an exercise in celebration or laurel resting, although I realize it risks sounding that way. Because we can't rest on our laurels. The problems we have in journalism, in higher education, in our economy are too big for us to do so. But I want to reiterate that the reason it's important not to dismiss all this progress and just focus on the negative is that it's impossible to solve major problems if you think you won't solve them and you think you can't solve them. And we should have every reason to think that we can solve the big problems that we have today. I would argue that in our society we have 4 problems above all others. If you want to quibble with that and say 5 or 6, I'm open to that entirely. My list of 4 would be economic growth, economic inequality, the climate, and our long-term budget, which you might describe as political dysfunction. I'm going to start briefly. I'm going to go through the 4 of them quite briefly. I'm going to start with economic growth. I mentioned a few minutes ago that economic growth has now been weak for more than a decade. Here's one way to think of it. In 2007, even before the financial crisis began, that decade, the first decade of the 21st century, was on pace to have the slowest economic growth of any decade since World War II. Keep that in mind if you hear people talking about the Bush boom. The slowest decade of any decade since World War II. Then came the financial crisis, which of course had by far the worst economic growth of any decade since World War II. We have now been living through another administration that has repeatedly made predictions about the recovery of the economy that have proven too optimistic. We are 15 years into a disappointing economy. Paul Romer, who's an economist now at NYU and spent much of his career in California, likes to compare economic growth to the biblical notions of hope and charity. What nearly all of us want for the world is not only a better life for our own children and grandchildren than we have, but we want, and that's hope, but we want a better life for other people's children and grandchildren. That's charity. Without economic growth, you have to choose between hope and charity. The pie isn't growing. Whatever someone else's kids and grandkids get is something your kids and grandkids can't get. With economic growth, the pie is growing. We can have hope and we can have charity. The second major problem we have is inequality. The one thing above all that I think we should be nostalgic for the 1950s and 60s about is the fact that what the economy was producing flowed to large numbers of people as benefits. The bounty the economy produced was enjoyed by ordinary people. That is not the case today. Median income is roughly no higher than it was when the century turned in 2000. Our economy produces a lot more than it did in 2000. The reason that is the case is that the benefits of the economic growth, the bounty, has gone to a relatively small share of the population. This is a major problem. It may or may not be politically sustainable, but it certainly isn't right or just. The third problem is the climate. The climate, I don't have to tell you, is an extremely difficult problem to get our hands around. It involves the far-off future. It involves uncertainty. My one thought about the climate is I think we should be less insecure about talking about the weather when we want to make the case that the Earth is getting hotter and this is a problem. The thing about global warming is that it warms the globe. That's not an accident. The 14 warmest years on record have all occurred since 1998. There is reasonable debate about why that is the case and what path it will take. There's no reasonable debate about whether the Earth is getting hotter and whether human activity is the dominant cause. So far, all of our experience suggests it is going to get hotter more quickly than we thought, and the consequences will be worse than we thought a few years ago. That could change, but that is the recent experience. And it is certainly deserves a place on any list of our serious problems. If you told me you thought it should be number one, I would accept that. The final problem I actually think is less significant than all these, but other people disagree about that, and I certainly think it deserves a place in the top rank, which is our long-term budget. There's a political scientist named Mansur Olson who argued famously that the problem with democracies is that interest groups over time will get enough power to do things that are not in the interest of the society as a whole. That is a way to think about our long-term budget problem. We have a situation in which we are paying vastly less in taxes than we are giving ourselves in Medicare benefits. I know most people don't think that. They think, I pay for my Medicare benefits. They don't. The typical 60-year-old will pay about $150,000 in lifetime Medicare taxes. That same person will get about $500,000 in lifetime Medicare benefits. That, in a nutshell, is our long-term budget problem. And the question is whether we can solve it in a society in which people think they're actually paying for their benefits, and the people who get those benefits vote at very high rates. I want to close by coming back to economic growth, because as I said, I think it is the biggest issue that we have. And it is because slow economic growth makes all of our problems worse: the climate, our budget, inequality, and rapid economic growth helps solve every problem that we have. We have never had a period of rapid economic growth without the deficit falling rapidly. We have never had a period of fast economic growth without most families receiving healthy raises. Even in the late 90s, when inequality was rising, when the economy was going strong, the poor and the middle class got nice-sized raise. Businesses prosper when we grow. The country itself becomes stronger. If we care about America's role in the world, and I think we should, we are much likely to be able to play a strong role going forward if we have a strong and rapidly growing economy. I'll quote Paul Romer again. The choices that determine a country's economic growth rate dwarf all other economic policy concerns. Which raises an obvious question, which is, what can we do to lift our growth rate? And there is no magic bullet or perfect, simple solution for this. It's not tax cuts. We've tried that. It's not stimulus. Anyone who claims to know exactly how to get our economy on track is fooling themselves or fooling you, or probably both. But I do think there are some patterns from history that are clear enough that we should take them seriously. And one of those patterns, above all else, is the idea of investment. The idea of doing things today, often making sacrifices today, to make life better tomorrow. That's what Bell Labs was. Bell didn't spend its profits on trying to make more profits in the next quarter. They invested them in doing scientific research. It helps to have a monopoly. That's what the internet was. The Defense Department didn't build the internet to win a war the next week, and we're all benefiting from it. That's what the interstate highway system was, which in many ways created where we are standing, Los Angeles. That's what the NIH is. That's what it is when college students' parents save to send a kid to college. That's what it is when a college student works in order to pay for tuition. It is sacrifice, it is investment. We used to be very good at it. We're not as good at it as we used to be. You can see that in the GDP statistics. You can also see it, I think, if you think about popular culture. And there is one investment that matters above all other investments. It's the investment that turbocharges every other investment. It is education.
I'm guessing that most people in this room would be happy to agree that education matters. Maybe you even agree it matters more than anything else. And I get that there seems to be sort of general acceptance of that in the culture, right? People run for office saying, I'm going to be the education mayor, governor, president. But I actually think there's a fair amount of skepticism about education in this country. You can see it to be institutionally self-critical from my colleagues in the media and our scare stories about student debt and whether college graduates can find jobs. It's not that they're inaccurate, it's that I think they miss the bigger picture. You can see it on the political left, where think tanks argue that education doesn't really matter, that essentially it's all about political power, and even if people get educated, they won't be able to do well. You see it on the political right, from scholars who argue basically that a lot of poor kids aren't smart enough to go to college. And more important than any of these sort of elite forms of skepticism, you see it in popular culture. To date myself, for my generation, it was the song Closer to Fine, a 1989 Indigo's Girls song that summed up the usefulness of college thusly: I spent 4 years prostrate to the higher mind, got my paper, and I was free. More relevantly for this crowd maybe, it was Kanye West. His debut album, as some people may know, is called College Dropout. Please pardon me for not reading the actual lyrics of College Dropout. I'm instead going to summarize the title track, which offers Mr. West's take on the career ladder for college graduates. They go to the Gap, they get an entry-level position, which then is followed by them kissing up to the boss, which is followed by a promotion to be the secretary's secretary. The album is called College Dropout. That refers, of course, to the mega successful Mr. West. Given all of this skepticism, I think it's important to be very clear about the value of education, to look at all the evidence around us and to say what education is. And here's what I would say it is. In the simplest terms, it is the single best bet that a society or an individual can make. It is, as I said, the lifeblood of economic growth. It helps people figure out how to make objects and accomplish tasks with less effort, which in turn allows them to do more and make more, or if they want, enjoy more leisure time. You can see this anywhere you look around society today. We've conducted a natural experiment in this country over the last 30 years. We've taken one group of people and made them massively more educated, and taken another group of people and made their educational attainment stagnant. As it so happens, those two groups of people are randomly separated. The first group, the group that has gotten there, become much more educated, we can call women, and the second group we can call men. Today's men are no more educated on average than their fathers were. I'm actually slightly less educated than my father was. Women are enormously more educated than their mothers were, and they are more educated than men now. That may not come as a surprise. This, however, may. Men's pay has stagnated over the last 30 years. Women's pay, after adjusting for inflation, has risen 25%. That's not only about education. It's about a decline in the worst forms of sexism, among other things, but it's mostly about education. It's mostly about the fact that women are doing much better in education today. I like asking this question because it makes people uncomfortable. What is the most educated religious group in the United States? It is Hindus. They are also the group that makes the most money, the greatest percentage of households making more than $100,000. What's the difference between Boston and the struggling old manufacturing towns of other parts of New England? What's the difference between Minneapolis and some struggling parts of the Midwest? It's education. I like these examples because they're easy to see, but if you don't like them because you worry about correlation and causation and all that, I would encourage you to read a book called The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, which will walk you through all the regressions and come to the same conclusion about the enormous value of education. I think education is important for another reason, which connects back to where I began, which is it should give us some reason for hope. A century ago, this country faced a choice about whether to educate everybody or just to educate the elites. It is an echo of the debate I mentioned before. Some people were saying, don't educate everybody, don't send everyone to high school. That's a waste. Some people aren't smart enough for high school. They don't need it. They're farmers and they're factory workers. It's a waste. Educate the people who need it. Europe, to some degree, took that path and treated a high school education as something for the elite. We treated a high school education as something for everyone. Claudia Golden and Larry Katz argue that the American century was the American century above all because it was the education century. We were the first country to essentially have universal high school education. The question is, what is it about 13 years of education that makes it a magical break? Why is it that it should always be the case that 13 years is the amount that everyone should have? I don't think that it is. I don't think that remains the case forever. We're living in a more complicated, technologically sophisticated society than we used to. And I think that number should, for most people, should rise. We have a lot of problems in education, the same way we do in other areas. But we seem to be learning some things that work. You can see that in the Washington, D.C. schools where I live. They're making progress. You can see it in some schools out here in L.A. You can see it in some schools in New York. You can see it in some parts of higher education, too, where decades of acceptance of embarrassingly low graduation rates, I hope, is beginning to change. The fact is, in all kinds of fields, we have learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. We have learned a lot about what works in healthcare and what doesn't. Dana Goldman and I were just talking about this today. We're in the midst of a historic slowdown in healthcare costs. It's probably not sustainable. On the other hand, it's real for now, so we can take lessons from it and we can fix our long-term budget problem. We've actually made a lot of progress in some parts of clean energy. We can learn things from that. And it's no secret what will help us use less dirty energy. We just have to tax it. There's nothing mysterious about that in all. In all kinds of ways, we have a sense for what the solution for our problems should be. I get that they are politically extremely difficult. I get that they won't happen in a straight line, that we'll take 3 steps backward and maybe 2 forward, and then only maybe after that 2 more forward. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that for all of our problems, for all the public pessimism we have today, we live in the single most successful society that history has ever known. And so as serious as our problems are, if you're trying to figure out what history tells us about our problems, I would argue that it leaves no doubt that we can solve them, and it should even make us optimistic that we will solve them. Thank you very much.
So you made the comment about how the Gini coefficient worldwide is falling while it's increasing in the United States, and the two things are surely connected, right? The Heckscherlian model says that owners of capital where labor is scarce will benefit when they open trade to countries where labor is plentiful, and that's basically what's happened between us and China. So the question is, are you okay with that? Are you okay with the fact that it's almost inevitable that if the world Gini is going to come down, the U.S. Gini is going to get bigger?
Yes, but. So yeah, we should put great value on the fact that people, particularly in Asia, enjoy much higher living standards than they used to enjoy. And it's not just Asia. I mean, the economic growth in Africa over the last now decade and Latin America is pretty impressive. So I think the idea that you are going to have some sort of creative destruction, the idea that you would have poor parts of the world rising and this would create some challenges and even problems for the rich world, I think is something we should be quite comfortable with and even celebrate, because it's not a zero-sum game, right? One of the great lessons of the last 400 or 500 years is that the economy is not a zero-sum game. The but is twofold. One, we're doing a really bad job of helping the victims of those trends in this country deal with them, right? So I emphasize education because I really do think it's more important than anything else. I really do think that all the education skeptics out there are only education skeptics outside their own house, and before they go on TV saying college is overrated, they're setting aside money that morning to send their own kids to college. But education is one of those Keynesian things in which in the long run we're all dead, right? And for a 55-year-old worker, you can't just say education is the solution for you. And we do a really bad job in this country of helping people for whom, yes, even in the long term, if these trends are good, it may not even be good at any point in their lifetime. And we should figure out a way to help them more than we do. And the second thing comes back to education. I mean, we would be doing much better if our educational attainment hadn't stagnated. We essentially had this enormous lead over the entire rest of the rich world, and we've let them catch up. There are a few countries that have passed us by. Sometimes you see stats that are a little more dire than is the reality because they count community college, effectively community college graduates in other countries, akin to four-year college graduates in this country. But it is now the case that we don't have much of a lead over many other big economies in terms of educational attainment and a few others. And given that the pay gap between college graduates and everyone else is at an all-time record high, we would be doing better with our Gini coefficient if over the same period that we had this globalization, our workers were getting more skilled and could compete up the ladder.
So Dave, I totally agree with you about education, and I've always felt that way. But I wonder what your take is on the growth of home education and Bobby Jones colleges and that sort of thing, which, in the past I thought would sort of disappear as we progress, and it seems to be moving in the other direction and really undermining the content of serious education.
I actually think that the Obama administration's attempt to crack down on some of the worst abusers of federal dollars in the for-profit education system was a really intriguing and well-intentioned initiative. They then backed off from a lot of it. Those for-profit colleges have powerful friends within the Democratic Party, and they backed off a lot of it. But they did some things. I would actually argue that the main problem was that they focused only on for-profit colleges. There are a lot of not-for-profit colleges that often are getting massive amounts of our tax dollars, federal and state tax dollars, and are doing an absolutely miserable job turning the students they have into graduates. I take comfort in the fact that the gap between what college graduates and everyone else is making has reached a new all-time high. And to be clear, there's no reason that should always go up. It hasn't always gone up. It's not like inflation and the price of lettuce. That's a gap, right? And so there's no reason it should naturally go up. And so if we were giving lots of people worthless college degrees, that probably wouldn't go up. So I guess I take some comfort in the macro picture that we don't have huge numbers of people getting four-year college degrees that are worthless. But I worry that we have too many people who are getting them, and much more than that, we have way too many people who have the worst combination of everything. They get college debt, even if it's only $10,000 or $20,000, and they get no degree. That is a really bad combination.
This is almost a personal question for me rather than anything else. In 1967, I heard columnist Max Lerner make an argument that the 70s and 80s were going to experience the poverty of culture in this country. I took it as an academic statement at the time. And then in 1978, we implemented Prop 13 in the state of California. And in doing so, from my perspective, we retreated emphatically from a social agreement with one another that we would send every middle class, non-achieving kid who could pull up to a front door at a college somewhere and sign his name to it and attend class, get a degree, for which we would all be better off because he was literate. He was literate in a very fundamental way. And we threw that away. The question I'm trying to get to, and I think you're struggling with it too, is what happened to our cultural decisionality? Because all the straight Protestant white men who put all that stuff in place were there, and as their authority slipped away, what happened to multiculturalism that it didn't come in behind it and say, we've got to have it too? What slipped the cock?
I don't know, but I agree with you that is very worse. That the universal high school movement that I described, and there's really a wonderful history of it in that book, The Race Between Education and Technology by Goldman and Katz. You can ignore all the economics if you want. There are a few chapters that are just delightful history of the universal high school movement. That was so important because we were deciding that as a society we were going to educate everyone, right? And it had huge effects. It made farmers more productive. It made manufacturing workers more productive by making sure they all had a high school education. Obviously, today that's not the case. Society pays a fair amount of people's college educations, but I'm guessing I don't need to tell this room that it doesn't pay all of people's college educations. And I think California is a particularly good example because, if I'm allowed to say something positive about the University of California here, there is no institution like it. It is, in many ways, the most impressive institution of public education anywhere. If you look at the percentage of students at UCs that come from lower income backgrounds relative to other public colleges, it's much higher. I know USC also looks better on that metric compared to a lot of top private schools. So it's clear that part of it is what's going on in California. But I agree with you. There is a real concern about the changes we've had in our culture that seem to make people less willing to sacrifice, seem to make people less willing to pay something for others.
And I don't know what it is that has caused it. I think race probably plays some role, but on the other hand, race has always played a role in our society. When they were deciding whether to have a universal high school movement, there were some of the same racial issues that we have today, right? The groups that were being discriminated against were different, right? They were Italian immigrants and other Catholic immigrants, but they were some of the same issues. And so I don't know exactly what it is or what the solution is. I agree with you that for all the optimism, to look at some of the things that have happened to the funding of education in this state above all is deeply, deeply concerning.
So I want to ask you about the role of government in people's lives and what trends you observe. And so as a share of the economy, government obviously has become enormously important. And you mentioned AT&T. At one point, AT&T was the largest employer in the United States. Now, by far, government is the largest employer. So it provides the safety net, and it does a lot of things to address the inequality that we're concerned about. Some would say not enough. But as we learn more in, say, behavioral economics, which you've written about, that how do we get people to change their behavior, there's a concern that government will play a more intrusive role. So where do you see that going?
I think there's a really difficult tension there. On the one hand, I think we should be comfortable with the fact that the normal state for government is growth in a rich society. I realize that's a sentence that will give some people hives, right? And I think that it's actually it's a deeply healthy thing that Americans are skeptical of government. I think it gives us a lot of advantages. But the reason for that is that as you become richer,
as a society, you want more of the things that a free market, that a private market doesn't do a great job of
providing, right? Private market does a great job of providing clothing, does a great job of providing food, it does a pretty good job of providing shelter. It does not do as good a job in providing education. It does not do as good a job at providing public protection, police and fire. It's questionable whether it does a better job providing health care, right? And so as a society gets richer, right, once you have the clothes and the food and the shelter, there's a reason that it's perfectly sensible that you want a bigger military and you want a better police force and you want better schools. And you tend to get those things by paying taxes and having the government do it. And so over time, the idea that government becomes larger is something that strikes me as sort of natural. However, government is also really bad at a lot of things, right? And so how do you keep the check on it so it's only doing what it should be doing? I think one of the real failures of this administration is to stay true to an idea that then Senator Obama talked about during the campaign, which was creating what he called an iPod government. It would now be an iPad government, right? Which is a government that was as user-friendly as your Apple devices. And when I've told them that I thought they haven't lived up to that, they've said, yes, you don't know about this program within OMB and that program where we've actually made government more efficient. And they're right, they've done some things like that. But they haven't changed people's fundamental sense of how well government works, needless to say, right? And so I think for people who are comfortable with the idea that government can do things that other parts of society can't, like make long-term investments that aren't profitable, it's no accident that the Defense Department built the internet. I think it's very important that we find ways to make government function better than it does today. And I think education is an example of that. We just give away too much money to colleges without asking for any accountability, public and private.
If I were to think back to, say, the first 5 years of 2000, and were to ask the question, what are the, say, 5 most important issues, I would suspect we might have global security as one of those issues. In fact, that whole incident in 2001, September 11, had a big impact on the economy at that period of time. That's a little bit of a side. You haven't mentioned security or global security. There's an enormous arms race that is really developing between China and the United States. A lot of instability in areas of Africa and obviously Afghanistan, Syria, etc. We now have tensions again with Russia and Eastern Europe. I just would like to know your perspective on how big an issue you see that being, especially given that we're probably approaching a place where that could, bring something into Los Angeles that could have a lot of damage and be very hard to prevent. And just look at, just would appreciate your thought on that as a
No, you can tell, right, it's, in a way, what you're saying is that, boy, you could tell, it tells us how far we are from 2001. We could spend this much time talking about the state of the world and make that secondary. I do think that it is a reminder at the very highest level that economic growth matters enormously, right? Because the more economic growth we have, the more we can afford to continue to have a very robust military without it becoming an enormous drain on our resources overall. I think there is no shortage of hotspots and problems around the world. And I think things like the fears about drones are real and require an enormous amount of vigilance. And not only that, but the flip side of that is that the military, like healthcare, is a place where we waste a lot of money, right? And we got to figure out ways to get better at that, not only so we can afford other things, but so we're spending money on the right things within the military. I still would argue that it fits under the larger frame that I've been using today. If you look at any measure of global conflict, Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, has a bunch of nice numbers and graphs on this. The number of people dying from wars is down a lot over where it was 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. We're doing something right, and that should not mean that we just sort of sit back and say we don't need to worry about these things. But I think it should also give us some confidence that we have learned a lot about national security and we've learned a lot about human nature that makes it possible that can continue to be a manageable problem, and a problem that isn't anything like what national security and global conflict was in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, not to mention every century that preceded the 18th century. Thank you all so much.